And now we'd like to welcome Stephen Ledoux with a small d to our pulpit. Here's a little bit of biography about him. He spent 4 years of Catholic seminary high school and 2 years in seminary college in the times they are changing 1960s. I think a lot of us remember that time. That led Stephen to complete college and an MA degree in natural science of behavior, today called behaviorology. After teaching college in Australia and China, and because, somewhat unbelievably, Ronald Reagan and James Bond both signed his MA degree, he returned to the studies and completed a PhD in 1982. He then taught at the State University of New York in Canton, where he met and married his spouse, Dr. Nellie Chase, in the Canton's UU Church. To preserve each other's jobs, they stayed in Canton for over 30 years and raised 2 children there. Then in 2016, they retired to Los Alamos, New Mexico, from where they visit their children, who currently both still live in New England. Okay, Stephen, it's all yours.
Thank you. I need to turn mine on. Is it there? It's there. There. Welcome to this science-based extended elevator speech on consciousness. People began discussing consciousness in ancient times, even before they began to write down their discussions. Up until recently, science had made few discoveries that related to these discussions. And thus, for millennia, these discussions remained informed primarily by subjective considerations and mostly theological, but some secular superstitions. We will not today go over that history. We will also not review all the discoveries, principles, and implications of the recent natural sciences that inform this topic. We'll start by covering some general observations and then move on to some of the scientifically grounded realities, conclusions, and implications about consciousness. Many sermons from pulpits, past and present, have discoursed on the topic of consciousness. As wide-ranging as that coverage has been, it mostly shares a core that has, superstitiously, treated consciousness as a kind of primary cause of human behavior. Today, we will explore some aspects of a more parsimonious, competing, alternative understanding of consciousness. An alternative derived from natural science, in particular the natural science of behavior, commonly known since 1987 as behaviorology, which is not to be confused with psychology. Perhaps you will find it surprising that we start with part of the wisdom we receive from ancient sources. After all, in seeking to better understand the concept of consciousness, we are moving to better fulfill the ancient dictum of know thyself. We could begin describing consciousness as the response of being aware, an awareness of being. But consciousness turns out to be much more than merely an awareness of being. However, because we are sticking to science, we must first set aside some related, superstitiously grounded abstractions, such as the one we traditionally call the mind, because they misinform consciousness. As a secularized version of the theological soul, the notion of mind has mainly helped hide the superstitions that so much burden the theological and secular view of the ancients. and so many of their more modern counterparts. Of course, along with setting mind aside, we also benefit from escaping some related superstitiously conjured notions like psyches, soul, self, personality, and so on. All of these label supposed and uncaused inner causes of human behavior, inner causes that actually are fictitious causes. Traditionally, consciousness gets used the same way. It gets used as an uncaused, fictitious inner cause of behavior. However, as science uncovers more of the details of complex human behavior and its interactions with physiology, we find that the label consciousness covers far more interesting events. Rather than as an uncaused cause of behavior, consciousness is fundamentally a response, actually a combination of many responses, all as outcomes of some other causes of behavior, causes discovered in the last 100 years. Thus, consider consciousness as a kind of complex behavior resulting from the interactions of these various causes with complex physiology. The result is seeing consciousness as a set of complicated, covert, neural-only behaviors that can and do affect other aspects of complex human behavior. How does that work? Well, let's start with the comment from a natural scientist whose name, B.F. Skinner, many of you recognize, but about whom too many people still have unwarranted misunderstandings. In his 1963 article, Behaviorism at 50, which I had the fun of updating in 2012, Skinner pointed out that the question of consciousness held a central role for the natural science analysis of behavior. Using the sense modality of vision for convenience, he started by describing consciousness as seeing that we are seeing, which we call conscious seeing. But he excised any mysterious implied inner agent who does the seeing by pointing out two general kinds of contingencies. Now, this term, contingencies, simply refers to the many experimentally discovered genetic and environmental independent variables that are in functional relations with the dependent variables of behavior, including human behavior. The occurrence of behavior is contingent on, that is dependent on the independent variables. What are these two kinds of contingencies Skinner mentions? One is our internal and external, I know that sounds like two, but it's one environment, one physical environment that supplies the variables that condition seeing in the first place. We call that unconscious seeing. While our verbal community supplies the variables that condition both our conscious seeing, our observing, and our reporting of what is seen. These two, our physical environment and our verbal community, interact. The thing seen induces our initial unconscious seeing responses, and these in turn invoke the seeing, reporting, conscious responses. Equally pertinent, when current independent variables are insufficient to compel the conscious parts to occur, it does not happen. For example, a hiker engaged in a conversation with a companion will step over an unconsciously seen football-sized rock on the trail. That is, the hiker responds to the rock by just stepping over it under what we technically call direct stimulus control, in which the stimulus energy traces, such as the photons reflected from the rock into the hiker's retina and on into the hiker's nervous system, these stimulus energy traces move through the nervous system without engaging major brain parts, but simply setting off motor neurons that contract leg muscles that make a step over the rock. Later, however, the hiker cannot describe the rock because it was only unconsciously seen. If one is later to describe the rock, one must first consciously see it. That is, it must have induced certain additional kinds of responses to it. For example, thinking responses like, oh, that stone has strange stripes. Then some later prompt, perhaps involving someone's request for details about the stone, some later prompt can evoke seeing it again. We call that re-seeing it and then describing it. Actually, as in that example, the thing seen, the later rock, need not be present. Other real variables, like that request for details, can evoke the seeing response, that is, the re-seeing response, which can then evoke a reporting response. As another example, consider that old gas-guzzling vehicle you have or had before getting your current hybrid or electric or gas vehicle. You can see, you can observe, you can report to the person next to you the guzzler's make, model, and age. Go ahead. Think about and visualize that old gas guzzler and tell your neighbor what it was. You'll experience doing it. Okay. Yeah. Mine was a big 1960s Chevy station wagon, about 13 miles to the gallon. It was golden brown, but that didn't help it. Because for most people, well, I mean, why can you do this? You can do it because for most people, this kind of response prompt evokes consciously seeing the mentioned vehicle, which is not present. All the involved responses, except the overt reporting response, all the involved responses are covert, neural-only responses of consciousness. Furthermore, your covert reporting of the seeing is an example of the kind of consciousness behavior that we simply call thinking, which is all covert behavior. When thinking occurs, which happens mostly but not exclusively as seeing or covert talking, it is not some kind of uncaused spontaneous event. Rather, when thinking occurs, it happens as a real, natural, neural behavior event, as a dependent variable effect of one or another real, natural event that functions as an independent variable. The sound wave energy traces from my speaking that gas guzzler prompt evoked your covert seeing and thinking responses, and possibly even your overt talking responses with your neighbor. Such thinking responses represent a covert, common, and vital addition to the variables that control subsequent, especially overt, behavior. As with all neural behavior, this consciousness behavior, this thinking behavior, can be difficult to separate from the neural physiology, the neuron bundles firing that mediates it. Still, as with all behavior, independent variables induce the occurrence of all neural behavior, including thinking, and other consciousness responses. While all these events may be complex and occur so rapidly that they constrain our measurement technology, causing us difficulty keeping up, they are nevertheless occurring entirely naturally. They are not spontaneous, and no inner agent of any sort is doing the seeing, observing, thinking, measuring, evaluating, reporting, or mediating. Now, is the occurrence of your gas guzzler seeing responses visible to me or to others when it's just thinking? No, because they are covert, private responses. That is, they are neural only responses. They are not overt public responses. That is what we more usually call neuromuscular responses. They are not neuromuscular, like the ones I'm making when I occasionally gesture, and certainly while I'm speaking. Those are neuromuscular responses. Each of us, however, as a legitimate public of one, can see, can observe our own seeing responses occur. And we can then report seeing them either covertly as part of ongoing thinking responses or overtly to others, more likely both. All of that so far only covers a couple of the aspects of what we call consciousness. And while the seeing sense mode is convenient, all the aspects of consciousness apply to all of our other sense modes as well, even the ones that we don't usually think about, like proprioceptive stimuli, when you feel your stomach ache, or kinesthetic stimuli when you know where your hand is. All right. Also, consciousness seems tied to the presence of certain developed brain parts. You need to think about that for a second. Certain developed brain parts. If those parts are there, consciousness is likely present. Thus, some level of consciousness likely occurs in any organism that has any semblance of these brain parts. Most of you have likely experienced the behavioral result with your dogs and cats. Consciousness stems from an extensive variety of conditioning experiences. That word here, the word conditioning, provides a simple way to talk about all the neuron firings and the neural restructuring that physiologists document as occurring when energy traces from stimuli set off sensory neurons. That is, the stimulus energy traces always produce any neural impulses, and some of these impulses then induce and constitute chains of consciousness responses, while other impulses then induce the greater energy expenditures involved in bodily movements, such as the overt behaviors that we see as neuromuscular responses, whose greater energy expenditures come from nutritionally derived bodily reserves. The consciousness responses of covert seeing, thinking, and reporting are just some of the kinds of consciousness responses that we can consider. They also help exemplify the process, the normal and very natural process of behaviors chaining together. In this chaining process, each behavior as an event, a natural, real event, also serves a stimulus function, both of consequating the previous response, the response that produced it, but consequating that response, and at the same time evoking the next response. The result is a fast-moving chain of responses, quite natural, but difficult to track. These cascading chains of sequential responses, though at times obscure, are not mysterious. And especially when contemplating the applied interventions to help solve problems, natural scientists of behavior quickly trace back the links of any causal chain to search in the accessible environment for the functional public antecedents of the covert events. By tracing the functional chains back to events in an accessible part of the environment, they locate potentially changeable independent variables that can make a difference. And this affords a measure of access to the subsequent internal and otherwise less accessible neural parts of the sequences, as well as access to the external parts where problems get solved. Those cascading chains of consciousness responses involve the interface between physiology and behaviorology, enhancing our understanding of consciousness. Now, just as to put them in perspective, physiology addresses how behavior happens, how consciousness happens, while behaviorology addresses why consciousness happens, behavior happens, including why consciousness happens. The behaviorology addresses the immediately available and hopefully accessible independent variables responsible for behavior. Said another way, physiology addresses how skeletal muscle contractions occur, that is, as functions of neural processes that constitute the mediation of overt behavior, while behaviorology addresses why the body mediates behavior, that is, why those enervated muscle contractions occur as functions of eliciting or evocative or consequating stimulus energy traces. For example, behaviorology addresses the functional relation between independent variables such as a table blocking the path through a dining room and the dependent variables of bodily mediated behavior such as the muscle contractions that the table evokes, thereby taking the body around the table. Such entirely natural events extend throughout the range of covert and overt behavior during every human body's whole lifespan. A common neural chain of consciousness responses, some speedy but identifiable parts that we could describe this way: raw sensation, awareness, recognition, comprehension, observation, and covert and possibly then overt reporting. Here is a more thorough example that shows all those identifiable parts of raw sensation, awareness, recognition, comprehension, and so on. An object passes by a foot or two from a person's face. The object's motion induces raw sensations as light energy traces bounce off the object and strike the retina. These raw sensations evoke awareness responses that manifest as shifting spots of shape and color. And these awareness responses then evoke the recognition response of basically knowing from past conditioning, from past experience, that those properties, those shifting spots of shape and color, comprise a butterfly. These recognition responses may even include the covert or overt verbal behavior of saying butterfly. These recognition responses then also evoke comprehension responses that could involve any or all of the wider covert aspects of this body's behavior repertoire with respect to butterflies, if previously conditioned, such as that is a monarch butterfly, a really big and beautiful, and the first one in the garden this season, and seeing one this early makes for wonderful feelings about the potential success of pollination this season. And then you could actually say that to your neighbor across the fence. Conscious behavior becoming overt. Other comprehension responses could include additional poetic and scientific implications of the presence of monarch butterflies in that location at that time of year and so forth. Much of this consciousness behavior chain we might also call parts of thinking and understanding and explaining. Also, other covert and overt stimuli could evoke overt verbal forms of these responses at any point during their covert occurrence. We can conceptualize the basic neural awareness, recognition, comprehension, behavior chain as seeing some object or event, that is awareness, knowing what it is, that is recognition, and understanding how it relates to other events, that is comprehension. We summarized such covert responding with the term consciousness. What we have covered today does a nice job of scratching the surface. One of my co-authors had a textbook that was 1,600 pages long. It was a three-course textbook, but the chapter on consciousness was 180 pages. I can't get that down to 20 minutes. But anyway, what we have covered today shows that natural science now continually and increasingly accounts for consciousness more reasonably than subjective philosophies or theological or secular superstitions. In conclusion, may this improving science-informed view of consciousness help reduce the superstitions still burdening our understanding of science and of human behavior. May this improved understanding help us bring more justice and compassion to humanity, to the biosphere, to the future. I hope this inspires you.
I have one question.
Okay.
Given your description in the theory of neurology, what would you say about the question of whether artificial intelligence can be conscious? You can take that to the discussion.
Oh, no, that's too important a question. The question, go ahead. Your phrasing was better.
The question from that scientific perspective, will we come to a time where under that theory, AI could be conscious, artificial intelligence could be conscious? So I think that's the question out there.
Yeah. Good question.
That is a good question.
It is.
Yes and no. What I mean is, it's very difficult to try to parallel what's happening in computers with what's happening with neurons firing. There's a lot of, oh dear. It's very hard to keep this short and polite. So the problem is that there's been a history of looking at computers and seeing programming and speedy time sharing and grabbing bits of information from all sorts of different places and coming up with answers and then saying that that's how humans work, that's how the brains work, We have a data processor called the brain, blah, blah, blah. This is backwards. What we have is, instead of physiology telling psychology what to look for, psychology is, there is a point word, tainting physiology with its secular superstitions from having come out of philosophy at a time when philosophers were secularizing theology. But there was a time when they had the possibility of changing into a natural science. But they became so successfully wrapped up with their eclecticism, which at one point was good, but now it has become an excuse for never growing up as a discipline. I hope that's still polite. I was trained as a psychologist. I've experienced it. But that story is for the table. But the problem is you can't easily compare. That's why I say yes or no. I should have said apples and oranges. You can't really compare what AI is doing with what humans do. That's not to say they can't become pretty darn good at not just accessing all these external resources, but accessing the resource that is the program themselves, the program itself, and say, what have I come up with? That may be a key to solving some problems in AI, like write my scientific paper for me. Oh, not bad. You grab the right stuff. You put in the introduction. I could never have said the introduction. Wow. And then the methods section. Well, that's accurate. You did that accurately. And the results. Well, you just provided the results that I gathered. And the discussion. Well, you discussed those results. Okay. Then there's references. And what AI knows is references start out with the author, followed by the year of publication, followed by the name of the journal, or the article, followed by the name of the journal and the volume that the article was in and the page numbers. You can get a whole list of references, not one of them is real. And AI, that's fine. AI is fine with that. People aren't fine with that. So that's the kind of problem. And it has no, AI has no, it's delicate, because can we presume that in given enough time, AI could develop a conscience, let alone consciousness? The AI program that the 16-year-old talked to while depressed, that had been programmed to encourage whatever the human was interested in, and ended up convincing the kid to commit suicide, didn't feel bad about it. And that's one extreme. There are other extremes. And so I'm sort of glad my eye doctor ordered me off screens. Yes.
Actually, I guess I have two questions, but it's sort of one. In order to be something that people can effectively scientifically study, it seems to me a definition of consciousness needs to require measurable entity. And part of that, a sub-question there, how much self-awareness has to be a part of consciousness?
The complexity, I'll do the second one first. The complexity of consciousness itself inevitably involves self-awareness. Not so much awareness of a self, but the fact that you are observing your own covert behaviors. The interesting thing is that this is still under investigation, but it looks like the chains of consciousness behaviors are single channel chains. For instance, when you're driving, and you've all experienced this, don't lie, but don't do it. You have driven down the road, and all of a sudden you found yourself thinking, where did the last 3 miles go? And it only started you because there's a stoplight up there and a flashing yellow light, and those stimuli impinge and break your consciousness channel stream. Okay, you were daydreaming. This is not recommended. Okay, but that's what you were doing. Your consciousness channel was one place, the road stimuli were another, and they were controlling your driving responses through that direct stimulus control. Okay, where the stimuli affect your nervous system, they stimulate the appropriate muscular responses. You make steering, you put on the brake, you let you off the accelerator, whatever. You steered. You didn't. This worked because you're not in a ditch and you don't have a police officer behind you, and you didn't crash, so it all worked. But you were somewhere else. Okay. And I hope it was worthwhile. Okay. Now, the first question, that's a matter of something that affects all sciences and affects the science of behavior much more crucially right from the start. What's his name with the apple? I can't. Newton, yes. Newton did not have to know anything about quantum mechanics or even what came before that. I can forget what came before that. And anyway, didn't have to know anything about it. But Newton laid the foundation to understand gravity that hadn't been there before, that enabled this Einstein guy to put his violin aside at one point and recognize that gravity was more complicated. Now, it's a parsimony question. It turned out that certain experiments showed that there were errors in what was calculated under Newton's equations for certain phenomena, cosmos phenomena. And Einstein changed the perspective into a different kind of understanding of gravity. And based on the equations he was using, those errors disappeared. They were accounted for. The predictions of where the heavenly body would be at a particular point came out correctly. Okay, so physics, like most disciplines, grows slowly. It accumulates its knowledge. And anybody at this point in time accumulates this current knowledge and moves on and maybe extends it. Now take a topic like human behavior. You are confronted by the whole range of behavior, human or otherwise, right from the start. And if you don't have an answer, what's wrong with you? Society's paying for the research. Where are the answers? There's society is so used to getting answers cumulatively that it has not been able to handle the fact that we don't know a lot about the actual variables causing behavior. We know a lot about some of them, enough that we can actually do some good things, some interventions. We've come, there's a downside to this, but we've become very good at helping autistic children with interventions, and with appropriate ones such that by the time they're in middle school, they are indistinguishable from their peers. Okay, but that's one area. What other areas are there? Well, an article about 2 years ago counted the areas of human behavior, or tried to count the areas of human behavior where difficulties arise and interventions would be helpful, and they stopped counting at 350. That's a lot of areas, okay? But this problem of having to confront the whole range all the time means that our science has had to make do with one of the other things sciences do. They extend beyond engineering applications into the area of interpretation. You look at events, you don't know, you don't have easy access to exactly what's going on. And so you have to say, what works in terms of what we already know, and including what we already know about private events. And there is some research on private events. And one of the things, in fact, there's several studies, and the most important lesson we learn from them is that private, neural behavior follows the same laws that we understand about neuromuscular behavior. And it's on this basis that we look at thinking behavior and we come to some conclusions. If you want to look at a process directly, I think this audience is safe. If there's anyone in here who does not monthly balance their checkbook, please excuse my next example. You won't be able to follow it. Okay, but if you observe someone balancing their checkbook, what do you see? You see them looking at a piece of paper, comparing it with another piece of paper, making a few marks on say, a pad of third paper, and finally they put a check mark, put their pen down and say, wow, it balances. Okay, what did they see? They see the same thing you see when you balance your checkbook. The same types of neural behavior, checking the balances, the additions, the subtractions, making sure. I got all goofed up about 8 months ago. We're still working on this because there was an extra $1,000 in my account. And I looked and found there was a $1,000 deposit. I don't know where it came from. And I went back to the bank manager, and he's worked for 6 months trying to find who made this deposit and did they know they were making it? Was this some random gift of charity, or I don't know, most of it's gone to nonprofits now. They don't keep that sort of thing. But it was just weird, and so I had a different thought process. And if you had seen me doing it that day, it would not have looked normal. But it would have obviously not have looked normal. Okay. Some of the other research that's been done with private events, one study studied urges to smoke, urges, which is clearly a private event, or urges to eat sweets, and used a typical single subject design, had about 9 subjects. And each of the 3 subjects was in a category. One of them was told, they all had to do what they were told. And it was all worked in a way where there was no value in lying. So the easiest thing to do was to tell the truth, okay, as they understood it. All right. And so in one condition, the person was to stop smoking completely for a week, but still count, every time they had an urge to smoke, they take out an index card, make a little mark on it. Okay. Count their urges to smoke each day. And another condition was to limit themselves to, all of these people smoked nearly a pack a day. Okay. And they were most of them became interested because they thought they wanted to quit. And I said, well, let's give you some idea what quitting feels like, but you don't have to quit. Okay. But for one 3 subject group, they had to quit for a week. Okay. They had to go on what's called extinction, because it seemed that smoking was the reinforcer for urges to smoke. Okay, and the another group, one group just didn't do anything different. in a nice control group, but you don't, each subject is actually their own control. And the third group was supposed to drop to 5 cigarettes a day, any 5. They used to smoke nearly a pack. Any 5 of the urges they have during the day, you could do them all in the morning, and then you can't have any more. And mark your urges down, but mark when you smoke too. Okay, and then just turn your cards in, and I'll tell you what's going on afterwards. Oh, I wasn't supposed to say that. I did this work. This was the MA thesis that Ronald Reagan and James Bond signed off on. Okay. The interesting thing was those on extinction, their rate dropped, urges dropped way off. Those with no change had no change. Okay. One of the 3 on what was called a schedule of reinforcement. They went to a variable ratio schedule, which normally increases the rate. And for 2 of them, it did. But for 1 student, it didn't. It made it go, well, how do I phrase this? I'm sorry. It was one of the extinction students whose rate did not go down. It went way up. It should have gone up. And so, oh my, covert behavior is not behaving according to the laws of behavior that we know for overt behavior. And then a couple of days later, the student came to the office and said, I think I should inform you that I just couldn't do, I don't want to quit. And I just couldn't do the extinction thing. It's just too hard. I had 2 cigarettes a day. They had put themselves by accident without knowing, and there was no reason to lie about it. They understood the importance of the data being accurate. So they came and told me I had 2 cigarettes a day. Well, no wonder their rate was higher than the 2 subjects that were on 5 cigarettes a day. They were reinforcing the strongest urges. And so their rate of urges was going way up, And so yeah, covert behavior seems to follow the same laws as overt behavior, but it is less accessible. It is not inaccessible. We are all publics of one. We are all well trained, even though it has not been formal training. We are well trained in observing what we're thinking, some to a greater extent than others. Yes.
Sugar, we take.
Oh, data were, you're right. Data were similar. Yeah, urges to see 3. That's a good time to stop. Yes, yeah. We should go ahead and close.
Yeah.
Okay.